Hi, I am Peggy Krause, and I want to welcome you to tonight's PBNSG event. Dr. Mulpuri is here to present Eat to See, How Can We Protect Our Vision? Just a little bit of housekeeping. Welcome to first-timers and to returning members. For those of you who are new to our events, and I realize that while there are some people here, that many of you watch this on replay, on the recording. This is PBNSG, which of course stands for Plant-Based Nutrition Support Group. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating people and promoting the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet to prevent and reverse chronic disease and achieve optimal health. Here at PBNSG, in addition to virtual events and cooking demos, we have an amazing team of specialized hosts who host their own monthly support groups. So I host the diabetes support group, and there's a heart disease support group, and cooking for beginners and gut health, etc. And our founder, Paul Chatlin, he likes to say together as one, because we all have the same passion for helping people to adopt a plant-based diet. Our membership platform is just one way that we help spread the message. So please remember to take advantage of all the events and the support groups that are available to you. Also, please visit pbnsg.org and check our calendar for upcoming events. And you would look under the events tab on the website. Also, subscribe to our newsletter and visit our shop, and especially check out our perfectly plant-based cookbook on the products tab. Also, don't forget that our free monthly community support group meetings are always the second Thursday of each month. Registration for the group is necessary, so please go to the website and register there. So, like I said, I am the host of the Diabetes Focused Support Group here at PBNSG, and our group meets the second Tuesday of every month at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm here in New York. If you can't tune in live, I realize that you might still be working, especially if you are mid-country or on the West Coast. You can always catch the replay on our website. So I'm a certified diabetes care and education specialist, which means that I have focused training on how diabetes develops and how to care for people with diabetes. I'm also a clinical exercise physiologist, and I work in cardiac rehab. And what an exercise physiologist does, if you're not familiar, is that we understand how exercise impacts health and disease and how the body reacts to exercise. I'm also certified to teach plant-based nutrition. So when you put the three of those together, my clients say that my superpower is reversing type 2 diabetes. Before we begin tonight with Dr. Mulpuri's presentation, I just want to remind you just of a couple upcoming events. On May 2nd, Jackie Ackerberg from Jack Fruitful, she's going to be doing a live demo, a three-course oil-free Italian dinner. That should be great. And at the end of the month, at the end of May, we're going to welcome back Dr. Mulpuri once again. I don't know the topic of his talk then.
It's a secret. I'll have something to you soon enough. I have a couple ideas I'd love to talk to the folks about, but I think I'm kind of waffling on which one I'd rather like to present first of the three. So I'll be sure to let you know probably by the end of this weekend on that, Peggy, and we can hopefully distribute that.
I'm sure that anything that you present is going to be educational, informational, and interesting as well. So if you have any questions for Dr. Mulpuri, please put them in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Mulpuri. He likes to be called Dr. Lucky. So I like that name because I would love to go to see a Dr. Lucky. So you're a little bit far from me, but in any case, Dr. Lucky graduated from the University of Michigan and Wayne State University's School of Medicine. He has served as managing director for the 501c3 nonprofit organization Anti-Naz Village in Detroit. Did I say that right? Anti-Naz?
Anti-Naz, close enough.
Anti-Naz, very good. Okay. He was president of the plant-based nutrition group, PBNG, and is currently the chief executive of Plants Nourish. He has been intimately involved in policy initiatives spanning the local, state, and federal levels, particularly focused on communities of color. He also developed and implemented the first ever mandatory plant-based medical curriculum for all 300 first-year medical students at Wayne State. So what we need. Dr. Lucky's work has been featured in Veg News, Forks Over Knives, and numerous newspapers and television stations. As a community activist and a doctor, he is a strong proponent of the benefits that whole food, plant-based nutrition have for the community and for the patients he serves. Dr. Lucky, it's all yours.
Great intro. Thank you, Peggy. And I do want to say, you know, the curriculum itself really came together because of the folks like you and everybody else at PBNSG who were able to bring their testimonials and bring their stories to those medical students and really made what will always be a memorable day, I think, for any of us who participated. And I'm very excited to discuss my topic, which hopefully will be one of the first times many of you may have heard a conversation to be had on nutrition and ocular health. Is everybody able to see my screen okay? I want to make sure it's not in presenter view. I don't believe it is, but if somebody could just let me know, Brett or Peggy.
Yeah. Everything looks good.
Great. All right. Well, let's get started. You know, the title of my talk is called Eat to See, Nutrition and Ocular Health. I'm a resident physician in ophthalmology at the Cook County Health System here in Chicago. It is something I'm very passionate about, and truthfully, it's not a topic that's really been explored in depth from a dietary perspective. So let's talk a little, though, about a more general perspective about chronic disease. We all know probably in this meeting here, if you're here, I hope you know, that chronic disease is the leading cause of death and disability in the United States. And we're talking heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer. The list truly goes on. And chronic disease can be debilitating. And it's not just about the quality of life it can impact, but let's be honest, it can be a real hole in your wallet. It costs individuals not only money, but also time. And the leading causes of death and disability are the leading drivers of our nation's $4.1 trillion in annual healthcare costs. I often say we spend the most money of any country on healthcare, and yet it seems we don't have much to show for it. And it's clear something is missing from that equation. And I'm sure you all know what I'm already about to say. It's lifestyle medicine, particularly I think plant-based lifestyle medicine has a very strong role to play in that. Now, most of the evidence that exists really supports the notion that plant-based dietary patterns can reduce the risk of developing many of the chronic diseases that we just discussed. And remember, it's not just about one study, 2 studies, heck, even 10 studies. It's about the totality of evidence that exists currently that about nutritional information as it pertains to disease. An overwhelming majority of studies will find, especially large-scale trials, very rigorous evidence, that plant-based dietary patterns and dietary patterns that emphasize a good portion of fruits and veggies tend to have folks do a lot better than their comparisons. And lots of fields have investigated plant-based nutrition in particular, ranging from cardiology to nephrology, to the kidneys. Diabetes obviously is a big one that Peggy was just talking about, and even rheumatology, which is autoimmune conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. These fields have actually had a growing number of studies looking at the benefits of plant-based nutrition in the conditions that many of these clinicians deal with. But really what's surprising is there is a minimal amount of evidence that exists regarding nutrition and ocular health. And in fact, much of our focus in ophthalmology has really been, from a dietary perspective at least, supplementation. And unfortunately, there's no real consistent evidence that exists supporting the utilization of a single nutrient. All right. So until now, what does ophthalmology and the vision sciences really know about diet and ocular health? Well, really, most of the focus has been on micronutrient supplementation as a potential avenue for disease prevention and treatment. But again, remember, we're always missing something. What are we missing here? Well, supplementation isn't my favorite thing because it doesn't really account for the impact that a dietary pattern has overall on our body, especially on our eyes. And we're really missing out on the synergistic effects of these nutrients, kind of like how these fruits and veggies and all the components that are contained with them fit together like a puzzle. But you can't put a puzzle together if you're missing some of the pieces. And if we continue to try to supplement individual nutrients, I don't think we're going to see the benefit that we hope to. But we know that certain foods in particular, plant-based foods, fruits and veggies, obviously, darker fruits and veggies, are potent sources of antioxidants and inflammatory modulators. And for any of you who have any sort of exposure to this topic, I'm sure you know that fruits and veggies are good for you because of what they can do for our body. And what I really want to look at now is some of the science that exists right now and let you all know where we're at in terms of ophthalmology and ocular health and what you should be eating to best promote the health of your eyes. So I'm going to focus on 3 topics that all of us here know somebody with, certainly. Cataracts, which are the leading cause of global blindness. They affect nearly 95 million people worldwide. The second is age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness in the developed world, and it accounts for nearly 9% of all cases of blindness, with an increased incidence noted in developing nations as well, as they themselves also begin to change their own environmental factors. And finally, I'm glad Peggy touched on this, one we don't talk about enough when it comes to diabetes, diabetic retinopathy, which is the leading cause of blindness in working age adults. And it affects over 26.5% of individuals with diabetes. So definitely 3 very important topics. And there's going to be a consistent theme. I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of some of the underlying mechanisms of these conditions, and then review why fruits and veggies work so well for them. Now, at the end, I want you all to give me some feedback and tell me if this was a little too scientific. It's really my first or second time giving this type of lecture. And I really would welcome feedback, not just for those on the call right now, but for anybody who happens to be watching this recorded. So let's talk a little about why I may be qualified to speak a little about this. Well, maybe, about a year ago, my colleagues and I discussed maybe we should publish something about this. Let's talk a little more about diet and ophthalmology and accumulate all the evidence that exists currently and put it into one research article. And so that's what we did. We wrote the systematic review of the relationship between dietary patterns and ophthalmic disease. It was published in the Current Opinion of Ophthalmology, I believe, of 2023 of last year. And remember, I focused on 3 conditions: cataracts, age-related macular degeneration, which I'm going to refer to as AMD from now on. Hopefully we all recognize that's the acronym. And the final one, obviously, diabetic retinopathy. I felt that those 3 were really the ones that had the most amount of literature surrounding them, and I felt probably the most pertinent to y'all as well when it comes to eye health. All right, little biology lesson for you all. This is our eyeball, and we only see one thing, which is the outside, but I promise you it's much more complex than that. But I want to review a few pieces of anatomy so we all know what we're talking about. All right, this front of your eye here, that's the cornea. I always call it like the window to the eye. It allows us to see through it, and we need a clear cornea to be able to have good vision. This little guy here is called a lens, and that is what we talk about when we talk about cataract surgery. Think about it as the lens in your iPhone, your camera, your video recorder, whatever have you. That lens over time starts to become a little thicker and a little more difficult to see through, which at some point, depending on the person's subjective vision, will make a determination to do cataract surgery. And finally, the retina, which is the back of the eye that essentially is a kind of like I think film for the back of the eye. It's useful to think about, and it transduces all those signals and allows us to have that input when we're looking out at the world. Now, cataract surgery is the one that I know most people know about. In fact, it's the most prevalent surgical procedure of all medical specialties. And there's an estimated 3.5 million cases, actually 3.7 million cases per year in the USA alone. In Europe, 7 million, and worldwide, 20 million cataracts. And I would argue that cataract surgery is actually one of the most significant clinical managements in medicine. And we can take people who are seeing poorly and have them seeing great within a few weeks, not even, just on replacing this cataract. And we see large improvements in their activities of daily living, as well as a decreased mortality because folks are able to see better. Now, complications are rare. They range from about 1% to 5%. But as the population continues to get older, these economic costs, these social costs of lens cataract are actually quite staggering in their own right. And the demand is only going to increase for the US of A. Cataract surgery in particular, because it's so common, still costs about $3.5 billion per year. So when I talk about how nutrition can affect the cataract, or I guess the lens in this case, I really want to talk about delaying the process of cataracts as much as we can, or at least prevention, to the point where once somebody's old enough, then we get cataract surgery in their 60s, 70s, they're probably their 70s and 80s, rather than their 50s and 60s, which we can see in folks. Now, if you're ever curious what an actual cataract looks like in that top left, I'm sorry for those who may be a little squeamish, that is a nice thick lens that has been taken out of somebody's eye, and we put a man-made lens in to replace it. And we oftentimes consider cataract to be an age-related complication. I know most of all here have heard it many times. There's a lot of conditions that are considered to be age-related. And as we all know, age-related is really a parable for a larger conversation about what somebody may have been exposed to. And there's a lot of risk factors in cataracts. We don't need to go through all of them, but any sort of stressor on the body can induce cataract. Even folks with diabetes have their own specific type of cataracts that they can develop. Obviously, some folks have a genetic predisposition, but trauma, medical steroid use, smoking, UV exposure, all these can induce cataracts. Now, we don't fully understand what causes cataracts. We have some idea, but some of it is that we have all these little proteins and they sometimes get misfolded and they get together, they aggregate is what we call, and that eventually leads to a loss of lens transparency. Remember, we want to look through things that are clear, whether it's the cornea, whether it's the lens. Being able to look through those clear lenses and clear windows allows us to have nice, good vision and seeing the world. Now, this word is very important, but it is not at all unique to ophthalmology. Oxidative stress, right? Oxidative stress, oxidative damage that our bodies can incur from a variety of different substances, whether it is smoking, and in our case, whether it is a high consumption of foods that stress the body through oxidative stress. And it's hypothesized to be one of the earliest and even one of the primary reasons why folks start to develop cataracts. And beautifully, the lens itself has a number of natural factors to protect against that. And in particular, again, the beauty of physiology, the beauty of looking at some of these underlying things is it gives us an idea. What should we be doing to augment our body's own natural capabilities? I mean, really, it is an incredible machine, what we have. And as long as we take care of it, it'll take care of you for many, many years. And our lens contains a remarkably high concentration of antioxidants. The most important one is glutathione, which I'm sure many of us have heard here. And it's very important. And one of its most critical functions is the maintenance of lens transparency. And as people get a little older, that glutathione that's naturally concentrated within the lens begins to decline, and lower levels of glutathione have been correlated, or I guess associated, with a higher incidence of age-related nuclear and cortical cataracts, essentially different types of cataracts. And another big component within our lens and the fluid that surrounds the lens is vitamin C, which protects us from UV-induced oxidative damage by regenerating certain other vitamins and glutathione. And again, just like glutathione, folks with lower levels of vitamin C have been found to have cataracts. Now, I hear what you're saying, right? We found it. Antioxidants. We found our solution. So what do you think people tried to do? Take a couple of pills and let's get some antioxidant supplements. That'll solve things for sure. That'll prevent the development of cataract. And it has been investigated for decades. But a huge review, called a Cochrane review, of a number of randomized controlled trials, these are the gold standards of studies that we have, really found no benefit for folks for vitamin C, vitamin E, or beta carotene, all attempts at supplementing. But again, what if we instead attempted to supplement these foods, looked for them in their natural state as components of our food? And after all, plant-based dietary patterns have been well known to protect against oxidative stress because why? They naturally contain a strong amount of antioxidants and phytonutrients. And on average, plant foods contain 64 times more antioxidants than animal products. And additionally, folks who sometimes consume animal products will have the generation of additional types of products. We won't get too crazy. Heterocyclic amines, maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. Either way, when folks cook this meat at high temperature, these have been associated with increased risk of cataract formation because, again, that oxidative stress. Now let's look a little at what has been found in groups that naturally consume more plant-based dietary patterns. Well, no secret, they've done some great studies, and not enough, but a few good studies in the past 3 to 4 years that I've looked at this. My favorite one being a Taiwanese study, which found a 20% reduction in risk for folks who were eating vegetarian compared to non-vegetarians. And the really interesting part about that is that they found this comparison was even more relevant among folks who were overweight. There's a difference. They took about 6,000 Buddhist monks, if I'm not mistaken, in Taiwan, and they looked at the variation of incidence in cataracts, or how often cataracts occur in both vegetarians and non-vegetarians. The real kicker about that study that I forgot to mention, though, is that even the non-vegetarians weren't eating that much meat. In fact, I don't think it was more than a serving a day, which is nowhere near how much we eat here in the United States. So usually what I think when I hear that, if we find a significant difference in a population that is being compared that are honestly very similar and pretty close to what they eat, and the side that we're comparing to is pretty healthy. I mean, they didn't eat much meat. They did all the same things that the vegetarian group did. They ate a lot of fruits and veggies. If we still see a significant difference between those groups, there's something there. There's 2 other studies as well. We don't need to get too far into it because I know we have, I'm sure, questions to talk about. But another good one to look at was a UK study done in 2011, which took about 28,000 people from the EPIC trial, which is a well-known trial that was an investigation into cancer and nutrition. And they found that as animal product consumption declined, they found progressive reductions in the risk of cataract. Now, the last study, again, interesting, was actually red meat and poultry were associated with an elevated risk of cataract development, I guess cataract surgery in this case, among women with diabetes. And that high meat group that we talked about a little earlier, remember, the UK group ate only about 100 grams a day, which is nowhere near the average consumption of the UK resident. So all of these studies together give us some indication for how we can maybe stave off cataracts. Here's another study I liked. In fact, it's the only one of its kind in that it was a randomized controlled trial, which, remember, again, is the gold standard. And most folks who are skeptics will oftentimes point to the lack of randomized controlled trials for being a reason why perhaps plant-based nutrition shouldn't be implemented more into clinical practice or into healthcare facilities. This one was actually interesting in that they didn't find much of a difference, which, makes you think, well, I mean, they had a Mediterranean group, healthy eating group, lots of fruits and veggies. They had 3 separate groups and they all compared them. The funny thing is the group that was the control group actually is not like most control groups in the Western world. They actually had a very low-fat diet. And for any of us who know anything about plant-based diets, they tend to be high-carb, low-fat, tons of fiber. So to have a low-fat diet comparison group is a little strange. It's hard to find comparisons sometimes when you don't have an adequate, I guess, a properly selected control group. And the authors themselves acknowledge that as a limitation. Let's move on to the next condition I want to talk about. Dry macular degeneration or wet macular degeneration themselves are under the larger umbrella of age-related macular degeneration. We call it AMD. The majority of AMD is actually dry AMD. It's seen about 90% of cases. So this is the one that we want to focus on more. Now, this is the back of your eye. This is the retina. And this is some of the changes that we start to see. And what happens is your vision changes, your central part of your vision, because the macula, I didn't mention that earlier, the macula, this little guy here, is responsible for a large portion of your central vision, what you perceive every day. So any sort of alteration in the layers or the integrity of the macula can have a substantial impact on the vision that we all have. And again, age-related macular degeneration, much like cataracts, is a multifactorial condition. Age is one thing that's cited, and that one we tend to see as people get older. They're at a higher risk for developing age-related macular degeneration, but plenty of others that we can look at. But some of these, again, should start giving you some clues where we're trying to prevent the development, or in this case, the progression of age-related macular degeneration. Diet, hypertension, arteriosclerosis, that's just hardening of our arteries, smoking, obesity. I see a lot of conditions here of all the ones surrounding these risk factors for AMD that are modifiable risk factors, things that we can take control of today to make the changes necessary to keep our vision for as long as we can and in the best shape we can. So this here is an interesting little topic I really want folks to know about who are interested in this area. It's called macular pigment. Macular pigment is very important for supporting the macula, and there's three ones in particular: lutein, zeaxanthine, and mesozeaxanthine. Remember, I don't need you to remember all these. I'm not going to give you a test at the end of it. But what's interesting is macular pigment is so heavily concentrated here. And its job is to also be an important mitigator of oxidative damage and also a filter for blue light, which can sometimes be phototoxic, and short wavelength radiation. Its job is to protect the retina and, remember, the central part of our vision, the macula. What's interesting is macular pigments are entirely of dietary origin, and the highest concentrations of macular pigment are found in dark leafy green vegetables. Remember what I told you, darker fruits, darker veggies, such as kale and spinach, citrus fruits, orange, yellow fruits, and tons of other vegetables. And the job of xanthophiles, remember, what I talked about earlier, is to protect. And because they're so heavily concentrated within the retina, especially the macula, that gives us some indication that maybe this stuff is important for us to be focusing on to promote good ocular health and good retinal health. But right now, there's no recommended daily allowance, how much we should be eating for lutein and zeaxanthine. Some investigations have said 6 milligrams a day as being associated with a reduced risk of AMD. But truthfully, it doesn't really matter when we're getting to those levels because, hey, the majority of Americans are nowhere near that. The majority of individuals greater than 50 years of age in the United States consume way less than this amount of 6 milligrams a day, 1.2, give or take, for men, and for women, 1.8 respectively. So really, a lot more fruits and veggies are needed, much like we all know the fiber, but also all these other important components that we don't know about as much need to start getting into our diet in larger and larger quantities. Now, AREDS is something we get asked about a lot. It's a very common vitamin brand that was based on some very solid research done in the 90s and the 2000s. And it was the landmark, it's called an AREDS 2 trial. This was one of the landmark trials that folks use to build these supplements out. And the great thing is they have been shown to help folks with a very specific subtype of age-related macular degeneration, which is the progression from intermediate AMD to advanced AMD. We're grading these conditions. It's very useful for a specific subset of people. However, for anybody who's looking to either prevent development of AMD or slow the progression from AMD if they're in earlier stages, this isn't very useful for them. And we tell patients that time and time again. But for a specific group, it was shown to have an 18% risk reduction of progression from intermediate to advanced AMD. Now, another trial here in the bottom left actually looked at, again, lutein and zeaxanthine. Just think of dark leafy greens, fruits and veggies. They found that folks who had a higher amount of this dietary intake had better visual function. They could see colors a little better. They had contrast sensitivity, and they had better visual acuity overall. They were able to see better. And they also, folks who are eating all this fruits and veggies with a lot of lutein zeaxanthin intake, had greater pigment density in the macula, which tells us, again, those nutrients go somewhere. And of course, at the end, what do you think they had a lower risk of? Developing AMD. Now, the retina itself is very susceptible to oxidative damage, much like the lens. I don't think we need to get into this as much. But again, remember, we want to continue to have intrinsic mechanisms of our body well-nourished to fight against these oxidative stresses as we get older, and our antioxidant capacity that wanes. So what do we need to do when we're getting a little older? Eat more fruits and veggies, because as our own body's protective systems decline, as is normal with age, we want to make sure we have the right nutrients there to support the eye in protecting itself. And the last thing I want to talk about a little is something that we talk about with more animal product foods in general, which is the imbalance of pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory components. Now, drusen is one of the major components of age-related macular degeneration that we talk about, and there's a lot of different variations in the type of drusen. But CRP has been shown to be an established biomarker of systemic low-grade inflammation. We see it in a lot of conditions. I'm sure Peggy may have had a conversation or two with her own patients, but it's a good marker of systemic low-grade inflammation. And we see it in a lot of other chronic conditions, such as type 2 diabetes, many different types of cardiovascular disease, and some cancer. And when we look at this drusen that we see accumulating in age-related macular degeneration, it's been shown to contain a number of components, but specifically CRP, an indicator of inflammation, along with a lot of other components that are also associated with inflammation. So there are some studies that exist as well on age-related macular degeneration, and they found that the diets that tend to be anti-inflammatory, diets that tend to be more protective against inflammatory states, what do you think happens to the folks with AMD? They do a lot better, right? This interventional study over here found that after 8 weeks on a plant-based diet, CRP, high sensitive CRP, was reduced 32%, which was even better than the American Heart Association's official diet. And again, we see CRP as well in other studies being reduced substantially by both vegan and vegetarian diets when they're compared to omnivorous dietary patterns in both healthy folks and diseased folks. So again, the foods that are good for us overall are good for our eyes. This one here talked about the Mediterranean diet, and again, how it has a lower risk of developing AMD. It's something that's talked about quite a bit in the ophthalmology spaces. And one of the big components that they focus on in the Mediterranean diet is that there's a rich antioxidant and anti-inflammatory component of the diet, which is protective against the development of AMD and its progression. Now, this one I like down here actually was a great review that looked at 35 years of evidence that exists about nutrition and supplements, about the progression and development of AMD, and they found diet to be a very important modifiable risk factor for AMD. So I'm not just going out on a limb here telling folks that, you know, maybe there's a correlation between ocular health and diet. There's a good amount of data that suggests for at least some parts of ocular disease, what you eat, in fact, matters. Now, the last one, which I see a lot of here at County, diabetic retinopathy. And a lot of our focus on plant-based dietary patterns have been given because they've been so effective in diabetes. We have tons of trials that look at folks being put on plant-based diets and doing better in body weight, in their lipid profiles, their blood pressure. All of these are also separate risk factors for the development of diabetic retinopathy. One study in particular, I remember, found that folks were able to drop their A1C by at least a point compared to controlled diets with just having a plant-based diet. And I'm sure the reductions are even more significant for the majority of people anecdotally who have switched to plant-based diets. Now, the biggest thing in diabetes is we have a ton of sugar circulating in our blood. When we ask folks about their A1C, essentially what that means, that number, it's a snapshot of the past 90 days of our body, and it tells us how much sugar our red blood cells have been exposed to. Well, when there's a lot of sugar in the body, it gets to the eyes because there's tons of blood vessels, veins that supply the eye and take things away from the eye. And hyperglycemia, which is elevated sugar in the blood vessels, has been shown to damage ocular tissues. There's a ton of different mechanisms which are beyond the scope of this conversation, but it would make sense that dietary interventions that were able to reduce that burden of the hyperglycemia would have an impact on a lot of the pathways that may lead to the pathogenesis of diabetic retinopathy. One of them in particular I like to talk about is advanced glycosylation end products, AGEs, which have been described in a number of other systemic conditions. And in diabetic retinopathy is thought to advance the condition, along with activating things like VEGF, which essentially what happens in diabetic retinopathy is over time, your blood vessels start to become weaker and weaker, and they're not able to get blood flow to parts of the retina that need to be supplied with. So your body says, "Oh man, I'm not getting enough blood. I need more blood." So what does it do? It, on its own tries to build new blood vessels. The problem is those blood vessels just aren't as strong as the natural ones that we have in our system, and that's when we call it proliferative diabetic retinopathy. And those blood vessels are nice and thin. They break, they can bleed. That's what we call a vitreous hemorrhage, which is blood in the eye. They cause tons of problems and will only continue to advance the symptoms that somebody with diabetic retinopathy is experiencing. Now, we just talked about the AGEs component, the advanced glycosylation end products. Surprise, surprise, who has the highest content of AGE? Well, foods that are mostly and honestly all animal products, with beef and cheese being some of the highest amounts and followed closely by pork, poultry, fish, and eggs. Now, another means, I think I talked about this earlier, is high temperature cooking. Grilling, broiling, roasting, searing, frying, these all accelerate the formation of new advanced glycosylation end products. You know what doesn't have AGEs are fruits and veggies. They have minimal amounts of AGEs, and even when you expose these fruits and veggies to high temperatures during cooking, they still have lower levels of AGEs. And that's why I think they should be one of the main components of a eye healthy diet. Now, unfortunately, compared to some of the other studies, I don't have a lot to show you about type 2 diabetes and diet. There really surprisingly isn't a lot looking specifically at type 2 diabetes and the severity, diabetic retinopathy and diet. There really isn't a lot. Really, the one notable study was done back in 2005, and they found that folks who were eating more cholesterol, saturated fat, and monounsaturated fat relative to carbohydrates, protein, dietary fiber tended to be positively correlated with diabetic retinopathy progression. Essentially, folks are eating a lot of the unhealthy stuff they find in animal products, a lot of that saturated fat, a lot of that dietary cholesterol. Those people weren't doing as well when compared to individuals who are eating the opposite, lots of fruits and veggies. And the authors of that study specifically said that their findings were consistent with a consumption pattern rich in whole food, plant-based diets and minimal in processed and animal products. Now, there was another study that looked at folks with Mediterranean diets. These also show that folks eating Mediterranean diets tended to have some sort of protective value against diabetic retinopathy. But the one big problem with a lot of these studies is none of them were really focused on diabetic retinopathy, particularly. Just happened to be one of the things that was in a larger trial looking at other markers of diabetes. Okay, I threw a lot at y'all, and I appreciate you for having the patience to stick with it. What's our big takeaway here? Is it that maybe mom and dad may have been right partially about eating a lot of carrots to protect our eyes? Well, it looks like they really weren't far off, and a significant and growing body of evidence is showing us that Mediterranean and plant-based diets rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and minimal in processed foods and animal products really help in the prevention of vision loss from 3 conditions that I've covered so far: cataracts, AMD, and diabetic retinopathy. But I promise you, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Hopefully in a few years, I'll give another talk to y'all, and this time we can talk about more ocular conditions and the impact that we have. And there's a ton of ways we can go with this, and the future really does look bright for the research of ocular health and nutrition. But we need a lot more, and I'll be the first to admit it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what more we're able to uncover in the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to eating healthy and promoting ocular health. Now, with that, I would love to take questions if you had any. And thank you again for having me, PBNSG. It's great. I had my start with y'all way back. I think you were one of the first talks I ever gave back in the PBNSG picnic days. And here I am now, and I get to talk to your audience about, I think, topics that are important to me and hopefully important to all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Lucky. That was very informative and very engaging. I have not heard any presentation about ocular health and plant-based nutrition, so that was something new to me, and I learned a lot.
Right.
Does anybody have any questions? Let's see. Let me go to my chat box to see if there's anything there. And
I don't see any questions in the chat.
Yes. Does anybody have anything that they would like to ask Dr. Lucky? Because I have a question, but I want to hear from you all first. Any questions? All right. Well, I'm going to ask my question, and maybe that will spark some questions from the rest of you all. So, Dr. Lucky, I've heard, I won't mention who from because I'm sure that you know of him, if not personally. So, is age-related macular degeneration, is that an ischemic condition, meaning for the rest of you that there's a lack of blood flow to the organ at the other end of the vessel, so that if there's a buildup of plaque from a high-fat diet, is that true?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about. There is some degree of ischemia in the blood vessels in dry AMD. Wet AMD is its own process entirely. I will say the interesting thing about it all is what I really didn't cover in this talk is I think we see a lot of studies from many different fields, from the brain to erectile dysfunction to heart function, about preserving really good, strong blood flow. Now, not to get crass, erectile dysfunction is my favorite topic to talk about sometimes because it is really the canary in the coal mine. It's letting us know that blood flow isn't getting to where it needs to get. And that's why some folks have trouble in that department. But what really is showing us is any organ that's not getting an appropriate amount of blood flow, whether it's through hardening of the arteries or plaques that are building up in the arteries and causing problems, that is going to lead to an issue down the road in any organ. And I didn't talk about strokes because truthfully, I would like to do more investigative research on my own before I come to you all with a talk about it. But we can get strokes of our eyes. There's plaque that can break off from our arteries in certain parts and go to the eye and block blood flow there and cause an ischemic condition as well, which on its own, again, stimulates that new blood vessel formation. Remember, I told you, folks with age-related macular degeneration will sometimes have that formation. Diabetic retinopathy, oftentimes when it gets to that proliferative stage, when they're trying to build all those new blood vessels, that's an ischemic condition because your body is starving. It needs that blood and it's not getting the appropriate amount. So in some way, shape, or form, we need to ensure that we have a good, strong blood flow. And that comes from having clean arteries, free of plaque, free of hardening, that are allowed to expand, dilate, and constrict as appropriate. And as we get older, our arteries will stiffen with age naturally a little, but we want to make sure that we don't get it to a stage where it requires intervention, whether medically and surgically in some cases. I think really that's what we want to focus on. I think it's a great question, Peggy. And the beauty of what I've presented a lot of, these are fundamentals for every organ in the body. As long as we have some degree of understanding that we want to have foods that are great fighters against oxidative stress, that have strong phytonutrient content, have anti-inflammatory components, and have their own unique composition. As long as we recognize that, we'll all be just fine. And, you know, it's one of the reasons why I get asked a lot about supplements. I don't truly believe in supplements. And that's partially because there is no consistent evidence in most places that supplements themselves on their own with nothing else will provide substantial benefit, because we're missing the forest for the trees. We're focusing on one specific area and then saying, oh man, that's going to fix everything. Well, find me studies that show folks doing tremendously better for decades. And, you know, I'll take my words back, but I'm sure we all heard about fish oil. I heard about fish oil my whole life growing up. And now everybody isn't too keen on endorsing fish oil, given its effects on the human body and in cardiac patients. So I think there's a lot of research that exists about diet. And I know it's not the part of my language, the sexiest thing to talk about. But I promise you, it is the cheapest thing, certainly, and the one that both you and your loved ones will enjoy the most down the road. Because at the end of the day, the reason I work so hard, the reason so many doctors work so hard, is we want to see all of our patients have one more, you know, summer vacation, one more day with their family, one more birthday, just one more memory with their loved ones. And that comes from having a diet that really supports that.
Thank you for the clarification. So in the meantime, we did get a couple questions. Luann asks, so wouldn't exercise help in getting more blood flow to the eyes? And can exercise reverse AMD?
That's a great question. You know, I'm not privy as much to the exercise part of it, if I'm being honest. That's kind of my fault. But I will say any sort of aerobic activity that increases your heart rate is some degree, shape, or form effective for your ocular health and any part of your body in general. And there are studies, I think, that exist about exercise and AMD that found a certain amount of exercise. I can't remember exactly, maybe 3-4 hours a week I saw of like low to moderate aerobic activity was useful, was beneficial for folks with AMD. Off the top of my head, I don't know enough studies about it. I'm not going to pretend I'm a subject expert in that aspect. It is something now that I'm going to read a lot more about since the question. But, you know, I was asked this question. I was speaking in Baltimore yesterday at Coppin State and HBCU, and I was asked that question. I remember it's really useful to let people know that it's not about doing exercise because you want to do it. Or it's not about doing exercise because you should do it. It's because you want to do it. You got to find something that you like, something that you enjoy, because let's be real, you know, what's the common adage? If you work in a hobby, you never work a day in your life. I think the same thing can be said about exercise. If you enjoy what you're doing, it's never really a chore. It's never really something that needs to be done, whether it's, you know, Pilates or biking or, you know, going for at least a 90-minute brisk walk around the neighborhood with your dog or by yourself or your friends and loved ones. Just find a way to stay active and get active, and that'll have positive benefits, not just for your health in the eye, but for everywhere. And studies after studies shown even folks who eat the healthiest, who have all the benefit, folks who are still active and are able to stay away from a sedentary lifestyle do better.
Thank you. And Steve asks, my eye doctor was skeptical about my plant-based diet helping my vision. I hope to prove to him that my whole food plant-based diet will help my vision. I am 75 with starts for MD and cataracts. I am now pre-diabetic after on metformin for 74 years. No metformin now. So that's a
I'm gonna assume, Steve, you haven't been taking metformin since you were 1 year old. So we'll say something 7 years. There we go. That's great. And I saw your second question as well. Well, you know, I'll say this: diet and ophthalmology are a very new and burgeoning field. That article I showed you is actually the one that we published last year. That is the first article I know of that has looked at dietary patterns and ophthalmology, and dietary patterns and ocular health. Most of the studies that exist really focus more on supplementation. There was some great work that was done in the early 2000s looking at Mediterranean diets, but overall a larger, more comprehensive view of dietary patterns and ocular health isn't as fleshed out. There's a lot of work to be done. Much of what I'm giving you is sort of the sneak peek. This is the preliminary stuff. It's one article, and remember what I told you, one article doesn't mean anything, right? It's about the preponderance of evidence. It's about what we see as a whole that allows us to make decisions as doctors. And I'll tell you, when it comes to your eye health, our goal is to give you good vision until the end of your days. And that means doing everything you can in your power to slow the progression of the conditions you have. Now, there's no real evidence when it comes to cataracts, at the very least, that we can reverse the cataract. Unfortunately, I wish there was. But there isn't. Once that process gets going, it's really a matter of time, and it depends on each person how long that takes to progress. Depends on the environmental factors, the environmental insults they may be experiencing that cause that progression. But rest assured, remember what I told you, cataract surgery is one of the most common surgeries. And I tell every patient that I've talked to, you are going to love the way your eyes look after a cataract surgery, because 97%, 90% of patients do remarkably well after cataract surgery, with only 1 to 5% being that complication rate. And as it pertains to, I believe, your macular degeneration, remember, a lot of the studies that we have now are showing not just preventing development, but slowing the progression. So keep eating tons of fruits and veggies. If you can't get enough when you're eating it, because even I sometimes get tired of eating fruits and veggies, blend it up in a smoothie, throw some bananas in there to make it a little sweeter, dates, molasses, whatever you want, and just get as much fruits and veggies in your body. My favorite part about having these conversations with my patients is I don't need to tell them the calorie count. I don't need them to worry about all these different aspects of their diet. Trust me, I used to calorie count all the time, and it'd drive me up the walls. All I tell my patients to eat as many fruits and veggies as you can. You can never eat too much, right? Obviously within reason, and minimize your animal products to the best of your ability. And you're putting yourself in a better position than the majority of the country. So stick along with it. You know, I wish you the best. As it pertains to supplementation, I think the one that most of us say is really B12 is useful to supplement. I'm sure many of my colleagues as well would agree on that. all kinds of doses about it. I'd recommend you read about it. Everybody has their own preferences a little. I know probably Dr. Greg will have a great video on it. Him and I talked about it some time ago. I would say also, I wanted to say one more thing. It's escaping me. I think that's about it though. And I remember now. The benefit is a lot of foods, plant-based foods, really have a ton of B12 supplementation. I drink soy milk like there's no one's business. I can tell you how many half gallons I go through all the time. And they're fortified great with B12. I've checked my lab values. I supplement every once in a while. I'm not as good as I should. Remember, doctors are the worst patients. and I'm terrible about it. And even for me, I mean, my B12 levels have come back great. So try to make sure you can incorporate a little in your food, get some nutritional yeast, if you can. You can find some ways to incorporate into those smoothies I mentioned. And, add a cup of soy milk, 2-3 times a day, in addition to some of your other foods, and you'll be just okay. But if you feel like you're not getting that, please consult with your doctor and have that conversation about what your levels may be. And you can always do some supplementation. They're pretty cheap, easy to find, and just find a good reputable one.
2 last questions before we close for tonight. Luann asks, what are the reasons when cataract surgeries fail?
Well, that is the reason why people go to residency for 4 years. There are a lot of different reasons. And again, I think it's important to mention that much of my conversation here isn't meant to be, medical advice for anybody. I'm merely just giving my perspective as somebody who has spent time in the area. There's a lot of reasons why people can have a failure of cataract surgery. Some of it may due to pre-existing ocular conditions they had. Some folks have inflammatory conditions as well in the eye, autoimmune conditions as well in the eye. Sometimes as well, people have some degree of complex anatomy that makes it difficult to operate. Now, failing cataract surgery is a little more of a rare term. Remember what I said is complications. That's not to say somebody can't achieve good vision after, but sometimes there's a couple of steps that are required to get there. And truthfully, I don't have all the answers for you yet. That's still why I'm a resident. But overall, most people who have some degree of complications are able to get through it with the proper surgeon and proper guidance. Some people may need extra drops more than usual. But it really is a case-by-case basis, and more importantly, a very large topic to discuss. And at one point, maybe one day you can shoot me an email, and I'll give you a whole list of reasons why, straight from the AAOs. Okay.
Hey, Lucky, since we're talking about vision tonight, I have to ask you. So, obviously I've been plant-based for 10 years, and this last year, and I, with family members, I talk about it as much as possible, right? It's up to them to adopt it. I don't push them or anything, but I've cooked as much for them as possible. Well, within the last year, my father-in-law went through a retinal detachment. Yeah, it was terrible. And watching him go through that, and I just wondered if there was any studies linked to diet and retinal detachment, or is that a totally different ballgame?
It's a totally different ballgame, Brett. I wish there was. There's a lot of, again, different types of retinal detachments. Every person is different. I will say there is remember, with diabetic retinopathy, what can happen to some people is they have those little blood vessels that form. And when you have those little blood vessels form, they can have their own independent complications and have their own specific type of retinal detachment in those conditions. So if you can work on getting that diabetic retinopathy under control, or even sometimes gone, it'll lower your risk for getting that type of retinal detachment. But in the case of your father-in-law, unfortunately, I don't have much advice. The important thing I'd say is just watch out for warning signs. That's always important. The 3 ones I tell every patient that we're told from the day we enter the eye clinic and are handed a little scope is look for flashing lights in the periphery of your vision, tons of new floaters that you haven't seen before, or feeling like a curtain's being drawn down over your vision. Those are 3 really big emergency questions that we want all of our patients to be aware of. I usually tell them, and you can look at any website resource, that's what it'll tell you as well. If that's the case, obviously seek emergency care as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's really wise to say. I think that he ignored the warning signs, unfortunately, and he'll be the first to admit it, because he just kind of hoped that it was just fluke. Yeah, and he woke up one morning and just was completely, like you said, curtain closed, and he knew at that point, crap.
And that's why we usually try to get people earlier. People have some sort of symptomology, they'll come to us. Sometimes we catch it on our regular eye exam. And I say this all the time, but medicine is a team effort. and part of that team is the patient. The patient is the most important part of that team. Obviously, we do everything we can to advise people, and even from a plant-based perspective, when I'm giving patients nutritional advice, I'm here as a consultant. I'm here to give them as much information as I can, and they're more than happy to contact me, when I'm out of the clinic or when I'm at home, and I try to give my best help and best advice. But at the end of the day, people have to take that information with them and have some degree of implementation. And if we're being honest, have a support system that's allowed to help them get there, which is why PBNSG is so important. It gives people the opportunity to make changes with a group. And I promise you, there are tons of studies that exist looking at the benefits of support groups and the retention level of people's lifestyle changes, not just dietary, but lifestyle changes. And the more group advocacy and the more group support somebody has, the higher likelihood they are not only just to adopt new changes, but to actually stick with it. Yeah. So, I wish the best of luck to him. I'm sure he's got an excellent retinal doctor.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Now
I really
for the
appreciate
other eye, if it is something that presents in both eyes, he's got a better sense of what to do when something happens.
Appreciate that.
Of course.
Perfect. Very good. All right. I think that brings our session to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Lucky. That was terrific. It was, again, something that is missing really in the scope of the human body. The eye is the missing piece. Thank you all for coming tonight and for logging in. And for anybody I guess if you'd like to watch the replay of this and get some of those statistics that you mentioned, Dr. Lucky, and I jotted some of them down on paper, but if you missed them, you can always watch the replay on the website. All right, everybody. Dr. Lucky, do you have final parting words?
No, all of you just being here on the call is so great. It's so heartening. And the thing I've been trying to tell people a lot more now is, in this day and age, it's so easy to be discouraged by all that's going on. There's a ton of very strong forces against health and wellness, if we're being honest. And I just want you all to remember that by living your life the best ability you can and eating as many fruits and veggies as you can, you're serving as an ambassador to everybody you come into contact with, silent or not, to show them the benefits of eating a plant-based lifestyle. And that should be something that you should be proud of every day. And anytime someone says you're a militant vegan or an annoying vegan, take that badge as one of pride and pin it on your chest, because what we need are folks who push the envelope, not ones who are happy with the status quo.
I love that. Awesome.
Lucky, it was so cool to connect again.
Great to see you, Brett. Peggy, it was a pleasure meeting everyone else on the call. Thanks for coming to listen on a Thursday night, and look forward to the next one.
Thanks for watching and for being a part of the PBNSG community. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for even more plant-based insights, expert interviews, and delicious recipes.